warm welcome to our viewers to this serialization episode of our QTV Business and Economy program. In today's serialization episode, we'll be talking to two distinguished personalities, both from renowned civil society organizations. The Business and Economy program is intended to promote the ideals of a corporate Gambia identity with the objective of forging partnerships through dialogue between the public and the private sector, civil society organizations, and the international community. By way of introduction, our two panelists today are Mr. Madi Jubate from Tango and Mr. Drame from CPA in the Gambia. As a way of introduction, I would first introduce Mr. Madi Jubate. Mr. Jubate is a Gambian development worker and a human rights defender with 20 years experience in social work. He is currently the program manager of the Association of NGOs in the Gambia, Tango. He has done extensive work with women, young people, persons with disability, and people living with HIV and AIDS in promotion of human rights. He has also conducted human rights training for security officers, policy and lawmakers, and traditional authorities in his country, including working with communities. He is a strong advocate for freedom of expression and has provided training to journalists on human rights and media. He is also involved in elections observations both in the Gambia and abroad. His involvement in an array of development issues indicates his passion and commitment to the empowerment of citizens to be the architects of their own destiny. Mr. Jundu Drame is currently the National Coordinator of the Child Protection Alliance, CPA, the main child rights coalition in the Gambia. He has also worked with the Department of Social Welfare and as a National United Nations volunteer with UNICEF. Mr. Drame is a child rights activist and women's rights defender with about 20 years of experience in child rights and child protection work in the Gambia. He is a trainer on national and international legal frameworks and standards relating to children, child protection, and child rights programming. He has interest in women's rights promotion, gender-based violence, and human rights in general, and facilitates capacity building seminars in these areas. Mr. Drame engages in advocacy and research on child protection and has great commitment to the cause of children. Gentlemen, welcome to the QTV Business and Economy program.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And let's get started. In today's episode, we would be discussing, naturally, about the business environment, but from the perspective of civil society organizations. As a prompter, much has been talked about the business environment in the Gambia. We have heard of the business environment being dominated by government to the extent of crowding out private sector. We have heard of the business environment being challenged with prohibitive and multiplicity of taxes. We've heard of the business environment being challenged with unsustainable energy tariffs, the generally being unconducive in terms of doing business, saddled with bureaucratic red tape, and overtaxing of the formal sector, but within the informal sector, we are told that people get away without paying their taxes. And we've heard, of course, the saying that Gambians in general support foreign-owned businesses and not locally indigenous businesses. By your reckoning, as CSO personalities, are these views founded, or are the ordinary Gambians, the entrepreneurs, the businessmen, just complaining without merit? I will start with you, Mr. Jubate. Generally, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, thank you. My perspective is that some of the things you've highlighted are misconceived. Some of the issues are true, particularly when you look at the taxation environment. We believe that our tax system is discriminatory, it's unfair, and it's very high. That was a point. Gambia had the highest total tax rate, or the second highest total tax rate in the world. around 2013 or so. But currently, Gambia is among the countries with the highest total tax rate in the world. As civil society, you know, the whole idea of civil society is to stand for the people because of government inability or failure, unwillingness to address the needs of the people, so that public services, public institutions do not reach out to all citizens who really pay tax, and also given the business practices of businesses. And some of these practices actually can be harmful to public health, to the rights and welfare of citizens, to the environment, and in many ways. So that where the private sector is focused too much on profit and the state is focused a lot on how to maintain power, it therefore creates an environment in which, in many cases, and not just in the Gambia, vast sections of the population remain unserved. Opportunities are not provided. So the whole idea, therefore, is how do we generate a situation where not only do civil society go to serve the needs and protect the rights of citizens, but also make sure the private sector abide by proper business ethics and the state fulfills its obligation to serve the needs of the people. So that when you look at the Gambia, given the issues you've said, I think our problem is one, our tax regime is cumbersome. We need a tax system that is fair, that would seek to expand the base, that would seek to bring the informal sector into a formal setting, because the large majority of our businesses are informal sector, but also to create a tax system in which even the formal sector would not have reason to engage in tax avoidance or tax evasion, which is an issue in this country. And so to enable that to happen, government needs to pursue policies that would generate local investment, that would promote local entrepreneurship, that would generate local businesses, particularly informal sector, to flourish. And for that to happen, there are drivers that need to be promoted. How do you make sure energy is provided at affordable cost, uninterrupted, available to majority of the citizens? How do you make sure transportation, particularly roads, are available? How do you ensure that you create credit systems? Gambia doesn't have an investment bank, for example. If a young Gambian entrepreneur or somebody in the informal sector wants to take a loan, you have to go to commercial banks. And so where government is the leading borrower, interest rates are so high, lending rates are so high, ultimately the Gambian investor or entrepreneur would not be able to obtain the necessary capital to be able to invest and make and make the profit to flourish. So all of these are factors that are there. And if that doesn't happen, it means what we are going to see is more non-Gambians coming with their capital and incentives given to them, by our own selves, because, GAIPA, at the level of GAIPA, you invest certain amount of thousands of dollars, you give in huge concessions that we as civil society are saying those concessions don't help the economy. All right. So when that happens, you weed out, therefore, or make foreign companies, businesses to occupy key sectors of the economy. And Gambians would have no choice but to patronize those ones, whilst our local businesses, whether they are in agriculture, in the service sector, and other sectors, would not be able to grow. So what we will see on the surface, therefore, would be foreign businesses. You take Karaba Avenue from end to end. You look at all the stores on the highway. You realize that most of them are non-Gambian businesses, And so it would give the impression that Gambians don't support local business, but that's not the case. This chart that I put on, or what Jundo has, these are materials produced by Gambians, for example. But those women selling those tubes, you look at the inputs to produce those materials. In the end, the shard will be so expensive that the average income earner in the Gambia cannot afford them. So they would end up having to buy, cheaper products coming from across the border. Okay. So all of these are factors that folks have to understand, so that we don't. Some of the things people say, that's why I said they are misconstrued, But then some are facts, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Drama, your take on the same question?
Thank you. I guess Madi, my friend, has said a lot, quite a lot of factors.
Yes.
But one of the role of civil society is also to have your ear on the ground, to hear the unheard, to listen to the people, what is coming out. Taxes or no taxes, I think the man and woman in Karawan or at Bakau, in Bakau, he or she probably wouldn't know much about what this tax system and what he or she is saying is high cost of living, high cost of commodities. So he sees that once the government is saying, no, we are not having any tax on rice, the cost of rice is going up, of bag of rice. The cost of cement, bag of cement is going up. So what that person is saying is actually the high cost.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I hear people say this, just because prices are skyrocketing, they actually want to say, well, government should come up with a price control system. Whether that's good or not, it's because the person, that person who is living probably on $1 a day is feeling the pinch. So I think for me that's very important that the state that regulates understands that whether taxes are high or not, the common man, is a woman, is actually feeling the price. You see, Mani has talked about foreign investors. I think for me, we need to encourage that. But the state also ought to encourage what you would call the development of cottage industries. Yeah? Developing that would also mean that the state actually invest or support local entrepreneurs. Because at the end of the day, it would be a poultry farmer in the Gambia actually competing with eggs being imported, let's say, from Netherlands. And so it would be about quality, but it also would be about quantity. Even if you encourage cottage industry, would they still have the capacity to be able to supply the market? I think we need to look at that. But for me, really, even encouraging foreign investment and investors, I think the state also ought to understand that that may be cost, but the rights of people ought to be respected. We can take the case of Golden, I think it's Golden Lead. Yeah, it's investment. Foreign investors investing in the fish industry of the Gambia. But look at what is happening in Gunjur. Look at what is happening in Khartoum. Is the state actually putting that into consideration? Are the rules very clear to everybody who is investing that you have an obligation to also protect the environment? You have what they would call fulfilling your corporate social responsibility. So how do we do that? I think for me that's very important. Encouraging investment is important, but I think rights, especially environmental rights, ought to be very high on that agenda. And anybody investing in the Gambia, local or international, ought to understand that these are the rules of the game, and the person must be willing to abide by those rules of the game. Because we cannot encourage investment, foreign investors, and yet have a degradation of our environment. I think then posterity would have to live with those consequences. And how do you explain that to posterity, that because you put money before their rights, that's why all these things has happened? I think for me that's important. I think energy, you've said it, I think it's a problem. I think we need to see how do we improve the energy sector. Because investment and business and everything depends on energy. If energy is bad, if the energy sector is not functioning, it's going to have a cascading effect on business, on profit, on performance of civil society, and performance of government, because we depend on all these things. So I think for me that's important, and that is not a myth. I think that's a reality we are living with every day. I hear this, and as I said, for civil society, sometimes it's also to have your ear on the ground. You hear red tapeism. I mean, people complaining that investors come, but because you have all these bureaucratic rigmaroles that they have to overcome, they get discouraged. And some would even say that probably it's also that red tapeism is also about corruption. And at every point, you need to dig your hand in your pocket to be able to pass one hurdle or the other. Whether this is true or not, I think for me it's worth investigating. It's worth anybody who is at that line understands that these probably are things that can discourage investors. And so it's for me, it's important that we put all the issues that you have highlighted into consideration, especially as a government.
Okay, thank you very much. Both inputs valid from both ends, but I want to have a follow-up question to the points that both of you have made. Mr. Jubate, you alluded to the fact that there is need for the base to be broadened, meaning there is need, for the informal sector to pretty much be formalized, albeit gradually. Because there's a lot of economic activity that obtains within the informal sector. Now, in consideration of the point that Mr. Drame made, in terms of the manner in which the public, especially the ordinary layman, perceives this issue of high taxes in terms of reflection in commodity prices, what is it, by your own reckoning, that Tango can do, or the civil society organizations or the NGOs operating in the Gambia, to engage with government in order to help bring about that discussion in which we would now begin to see how do we begin to gradually and methodically formalize the informal sector, even if it's going to take 5-10 years, so that we can now see a broadened tax base, possibly a reduction in the tax rates because you have a broader base, and hopefully that improvement in taxes because of a broadened base and more economic activity would be reflected in prices of commodities. What do you think that the CSO and the NGOs can do to help government in that regard?
Yeah, our role is essentially advocacy. To raise these issues, engage with the government to advocate for changes in policies, in laws, but also to ensure the efficient performance of public institutions in their service delivery and provision of facilities to see the business sector, particularly the informal sector, flourish, to grow, generate employment, generate profits, revenue for themselves. So since 2012, Tango effectively began this advocacy. That is when Pitch was first launched. I remember we generated, created this idea of policy dialogue, where we bring in public sector, private sector, the civil society, and other actors to look at major public policy issues, national development issues, to engage, to discuss in an open forum. So in 2012, we had our first policy dialogue, and it was focused on national development. Looking at the page, what next? How do we make sure we maximize whatever Pitch aim to achieve? Bearing in mind that we've been on these national development programs, for a long time, and yet poverty, deprivation continues to increase. Provision of basic social services are limited, expensive, cost of living going high. So our role is basically to do that advocacy and, of course, to raise awareness. And more than any time now is the period we want to really emphasize that, because we have reviewed that until 2016 or 17, that environment was limited in the way we could engage to advocate. Remember, I've been in committees at the level of Minister of Trade. We participated in the creation of the employment policy, and we raised fundamental issues. We looked at the issues of the Labor Act, how inadequate it is, how it is not helping in many ways. So that at the end of the day, our advocacy would be, how do we ensure the drivers of the economy are available at affordable cost? Because cost of living would be high so long as taxes are high, would be high so long as businesses, small or big, are incurring huge costs in order to operate. They would be high so long as basic services like energy are not easily available, are not always available, so that most businesses are either out of business for most of the day because there's no electricity, or they would have to buy generators or other means of energy. So how do we address these things is the fundamental issue. So our role in this is essentially advocacy based also on research. so that it's evidence-based. That is not just looking at the Gambia, but looking at the Gambia, within the context of the region and the rest of the world. I mean, we know World Bank produces, for example, annually doing business report. And when you look at that report, in terms of the red tape Nunu talks about, I mean, how many days does it take to register a business? I mean, what requirement does it take to register a business? I mean, the taxes that you pay in this country. And all of those factors, based on the indicators of that report, would tell you Gambia is a difficult environment for business to flourish, particularly for local businesses. And I think any careful observer would notice how our little businesses, our small businesses, really struggle, to grow in this country. And simply because the opportunities are not there, I mean, for investment. And then all of the obstacles, as I've highlighted, are also present, taxes, energy, and other inputs. So the cost of doing business becomes so high that little businesses cannot just flourish. And probably there's a cultural context to this whole issue, and that also comes in terms of our awareness creation. I know with partnerships with other civil society organizations, because we have a number of civil society organizations that are into microfinance, that are into building capacity of young women, of communities in terms of income generation, of providing skills for self-employment. So we have a number of those kind of organizations. But then at the end of the day, what also is the perception, of a Gambian, of an average Gambian to operate a business? What is our cultural context? So that if I want to run a small business, I mean, I have a family that only depends on me, or I don't have a culture of savings or a culture of, I mean, I don't know, self-control sort of in terms of, how I manage my resources, it becomes a problem. So many other little businesses also would collapse simply because the way of life we live. How do you save? How do you prevent wastage? I mean, here, our social setting is such that we spend so much money, on ceremonies, on festivals, on, dress, So one needs also that awareness creation to train people how to do business, how to run a business, profitably. So all of these are things that civil society, this is the focus, because I think at the end of the day we want to defeat poverty, and the defeat of poverty requires the participation of all. So our role is very clear. Individuals have a role as citizens. I mean, of course, the state, has also a huge role in that regard. So our role would essentially be advocacy and awareness creation, and capacity building, of course.
Talking of advocacy, and here I would go to Mr. Drame. You spoke of Jubate. You spoke of how in the previous regime it was difficult for that engagement vis-a-vis civil society organizations. But under the new Gambia dispensation, the belief is that that possibility for engagement has been enhanced. Now, Mr. Drame, what I want to know is, has there been a formidable engagement with the current regime in order for civil society to perhaps put forward a program of engagement, a program of support, so that at least, because I think that too is important. It's one thing to say, yes, this is our role is advocacy, our role is programming, our role is perhaps helping, with policy response frameworks and stuff. But has that engagement happened?
Okay, thank you very much. I guess Madi and Tango would probably be in better position, because I think they have started the engagement. But just to connect to what Madi was saying, the role of civil society basically is to amplify voice, the voice of the people. But for me, I think that should not only be the role. I think there should be a direct interface, and civil society can precipitate that, can start that between the people themselves and duty bearers. I think for me that's very important, because whilst laws and policies are made in halls, Kairaba Hotel, wherever. That is not where they are lived. They are lived on the ground. They are lived by the people. And so I think bringing civil society can play that role, just not only about advocacy. Because advocacy also it means that the people who feel it actually are also involved in it. Because advocacy is effective when those who are involved in it, those who feel it, those who are living it, actually take the lead. For me, I think that's important. But to your question, I think Tango has, which is the umbrella organization, has tried to reposition itself vis-a-vis New Gambia, vis-a-vis its new role. So I think what civil society has recognized is that in the previous regime, it did not play its role as expected. Of course, it did, but not as expected as it should be. And I think civil society, under the aegis of Tango, is trying to reposition that. And maybe Mahdi would be able to say what their plans are. I can only, what we are trying to do at CPA, as a civil society organization, is to ensure that issues of children are very high on the political agenda, is to engage the state on that, for the state also fulfills its obligations towards children, its reporting obligations, but also fulfilling the rights of children. So we are also at CPA trying to see how do we move now really from talking about soft rights of children to talk about what you would call hardcore human rights issues affecting children.
Before Mr. Jubate comes on what Tango is doing under the New Gambia dispensation, let me just do a follow-up question. I mean, we hear the phrase "catch them young," and I think this is perhaps where CPA comes in. Are there programs that CPA has that sort of engages at the level of the primary education level to sort of bring to the fore certain social issues that could very well help, and contribute to the upbringing of these children, so that by the time they are of age and are able to participate, politically, that they're aware of some of the issues that perhaps some of the current people who are, of suffrage age are not able to, to participate in.
Yes, we are. We, at the school level, at the community level, we are creating or have created what we call voice clubs. And we have also created at the community level what we call community child protection committees. Basically to instill a sense of citizenship in children, but also make children understand what their roles are. This is what I tell politicians when I meet them, that nearly about 42 or 45% of the population of this country is under the age of 18 years. And so we cannot, in the current New Gambia, we cannot neglect that population. That a child who is 15 years today, in 2018, would reach the voting age in 3 years' time. A child who is 14 years or 13 years, in 4 years, 5 years, would be a voter. So we cannot, and so politicians and the current dispensation cannot neglect that population. That population ought to be actively engaged in politics. They actually need to know how the state operates. They need to know the functions of the three arms of government, but also the roles and responsibilities of citizens in driving their own destiny. So at CPA level, we are doing that really. That is our core mandate, because child participation is not just a right of a child, but is a core human rights principle or child rights principle. So at state level, we are at local level, at community level, at school level, we are engaging with children. We are raising the awareness of children, because as you have highlighted or said, it's important that children understand what their roles are. Children understand what rights they have, what responsibilities they have, and that the future, whatever we are building for them, whatever we are creating today, the National Development Plan, it's actually for children, because it's building a future, but it's building a future in which children are going to live. So those children have that right to participate in decision making, to participate in the formulation of that. I was at a particular meeting and I asked a fundamental question. what role did children play in the formulation of the National Development Plan, 2018-2021? What role? How have the voices of children actually permeate that plan? And as far as I know, children were not actively involved in the formulation of that plan. So how do we have an architect who designs a house but doesn't consult those who are going to live in that house? So we are building a future. We are creating a future for children, but children are not actively engaged in that future.
But let me just cut you there. When you say the participation of children in the development of the NDP, here you're referring to representatives like yourselves being invited, or are you talking of children, high school students actually participating within?
I'm talking about village meetings, school meetings,
okay.
where you don't have you to speak for children. Children can actually speak for themselves. Children know what future they want. Children have their own aspirations, so they can tell you, this is the Gambia we want to have in 2021. This is the Gambia this is the KMC we want to have in 2021. This is the Karawan we want to have. So it's not about the representatives of children. It's not about Njundu as a child rights activist speaking on behalf of children. Children can speak for themselves. So it's about engaging children there at that local level.
Selectively.
No, well, whether selectively, you can have a representation of children, but if you can actually go to a particular school, even for 1 hour or 2 hours, and engage the whole school, that is still much better.
Okay.
I think to add to that, that's been one of our weaknesses in building national programs or ideas like this. We claim consultation, but when you understand the elements of consultation, participatory process, you realize that participation is lacking. Not even for children or youth, but even at our level, organizations like us. So we assume that if the Minister of Finance in developing the National Development Plan, you hold a workshop at Paradise Hotel, invite civil society, and so therefore they have participated. But at the end of the day, the issues they will bring on the table, the concerns they will raise in the final product of the document, they are not even there. So that, what is the value of that participation? When you are not going to really consider the issues that, these organizations are going to bring. And that's a huge shortcoming that we have. I remember in the development of the page, the usual process took place. At the end of the, the process, when the first draft was sent, I remember submitting a 5-page observation of the issues in the page, and I got no response. And so I had no doubts, and I have told folks overseeing the page that this is not going to deliver the Gambia. So just as we had the policy dialogue on the page in 2012, we're going to have another policy dialogue on the NDP. Because we looked at the NDP as it is, and it's very high on ambitions, on ideals. I understand. But when you come now to the nitty-gritties, particularly in its theory of change, on indicators, on targets, on the evidence, you realize, shortcomings. So that it tells you this document as it is would effectively not make much difference from the page. Particularly if still the enabling environment remains the same. That is, the policy institutional framework remains the same.
Let me come in there and ask the question in terms of the manner in which the policy dialogue, your policy dialogue, takes place. Should the policy dialogue, should it have been anticipatory? Should it have been proactive? Because now, it would seem as if the NDP has pretty much been set. It has been finalized, it has been validated, and now we're just talking of perhaps having done round tables. I'm sure we've got a couple that would probably have happened already, and we are now at the implementation stage. So holding a policy dialogue on a document that has pretty much been consummated, that is unlikely to get government to perhaps do a review of the page.
I think for me, really, the police, because at the end of the day, what matters is implementation. What matters is what vision do you have. So it may be couched in that flowery thing. The challenge now would be, how do you practicalize this? How do you effectively realize this? So I think that the policy dialogues would be important in that aspect.
Okay.
To say, well, this is how we think you ought to go. This is the way you ought to do this to be able to bring about a meaningful change in the lives of the people. But whether the state listens or not is a different matter altogether. And really, you can have policy dialogue, and at the end of the day, the state goes to do what it thinks fit. But I think doing the policy dialogue, even if the state doesn't listen, is a fulfillment of an obligation you have. For me, I think the policy dialogue would actually fulfill such an aim. But you know, relating to consultation and all these things, you see, we have what we call open space, and I think civil society, as Tango is doing, is to actually say this is our space, and we are going to take it. But you have what you call a closed space, and quite a lot of closed-door meetings that the state conducts around the page, and all this development initiative. It doesn't invite civil society. It's for the state. The state does it. And you have what space that they call invited space. And really, the invited space is, you either invite yourself or the state invites you. And oftentimes, at this invited space, if the state doesn't invite you, if the state doesn't involve civil society, it becomes difficult for civil society to engage, to go in. Because that is still the state's space. So I think what the dialogues do is actually to say, well, state, this is our space, and we are inviting you to be part of that, so that we discuss, we negotiate, we chart the way forward together.
I wanted to ask, one of the people that I look up to as role models, when this idea was being conceived in terms of having a business and economy program, said to me, and he's a former colleague at the bank, that the challenge, Ben, is getting the state or getting the people who should listen to listen, because this is very important. Now, I'm going to throw back the same question to you, and Mari can jump in as well. What is it, or how is it that we can begin to make sure that the people who need to listen, the people who have the authority, the people who come up with the policies, proactively, and before policies are promulgated, for them to hear perhaps the various versions and takes of people regarding those very policy pronouncements? What would you suggest? Because the whole idea about this program, as I said, is to promote this ideal of a corporate Gambia identity, and to begin to get the public and the private sector, the civil society organizations, and the international community to dialogue in a proactive manner, so that when things are done, when policies are being created, they hear civil society organizations, they hear the views of the private sector, they onboard those, and hopefully in that manner, we would begin to make progress as a country. So what would you suggest?
You see, I'll suggest that civil society, including the private sector, actually play a leadership role. You don't, sometimes I tell my friends, you don't wait to be invited. If you know a space is there, go. But I think leadership in the sense, for instance, when the private sector or the GCCI knows that the state has a plan for this, what leadership role do you play? How does civil society come up with concept papers, with technical papers? Because that helps the state also. That you come out with such papers, with position papers, with technical papers, with concept notes, to tell the state this is how we think this should go. And we see that lacking really to a greater extent from civil society or the private sector. So everything is state driven, and we see ourselves as part of the coach. And no, we are not. We are supposed to play a leadership role. We are supposed to tell the state this is how we think we have a constitutional, that would soon be constitutional reform, what can the Bar Association play? What leadership role? Can they audit the constitution, look at all the areas they think needs reform? Have a technical paper around it and submit to the state. We have a whole business, we have the GCCI, we have Tango, we have CPA. What can we do? Because I think sometimes we wait to be invited. And it's in the nature of states not to invite a critical voice, to sideline critical voice. So I think for me it's about taking that space, playing a leadership role, really, providing technical support to the state. Because civil society and the private sector, they have that. They have the knowledge, they have the expertise, and so they should lend that expertise to the state. And in that way, civil society, the private sector, the people, non-state actors would set the agenda for the state. But oftentimes we do not. It's the state sets the agenda and then invite us. And sometimes, as you say, the agenda is already set. And how do you change that? You find it difficult. When you set the agenda for the state, and that's where, that is the critical role that civil society ought to play. Because civil society is closer to the people than government. Civil society feels the people. Civil society knows the issues affecting the people. Civil society often has a wider horizon than the state. And therefore, it should be able to play that role. And I hope that in the new Gambia, really, civil society, the private sector, non-state actors will actually play that leadership role and set the agenda for the state.
Mr. Butter?
Yeah, I think that's the way forward. And that feeds to the question you asked earlier, what is civil society doing to engage in this new Gambia? And so it's leadership, as he's trying to say, of civil society, of organizing, mobilizing the citizens to understand that that leadership includes them, that, the state is here to serve them. And if there are leaders in this country, the leaders are the people. What we call a president, a parliamentarian, the public service, public sector, public officials are our servants. So that is why Tango has launched a program called the Gambia We Want, a campaign that for the first time, let Gambians now determine the kind of Gambia we want. That since independence, this Gambia has been determined by politicians, by public officials, a narrative created by them and running the Gambia. And the end result of that is after 52 years, poverty has just increased. Deprivation is widespread. Provision of availability of basic social services are limited and expensive and erratic. And quality of basic services, affordability such as health or education have gone down. So it is high time. Meantime, taxes have gone up. Cost of living has gone up. So Gambians now have to control the narrative. What kind of Gambia do we want? What kind of development agenda do we want? So that we raise these issues and make the government listen to us through various avenues, whether it is going to be through, protests or strikes, or through litigation, or through petitioning, or through our votes, but empower citizens to realize that henceforth, let us determine this Gambia according to our will, our desire. So we have launched this campaign, the Gambia We Want. It was launched February 12th in Brikama, West Coast region, where within the West Coast region, we invited everyone across the board, livestock owners in Brikama, people in the Brikama market, persons with disability, young people, women, all of those folks have been invited. Chiefs, alkalulu, priests and imams, across the society. And we are now heading towards organizing one in NBA. And we want to do this in all regions. We've established a program, a talk show on it, the Gambia We Want, on West Coast Radio. So all of these are ways where we want to engage the citizens. So when those voices become loud enough, the authorities would have no choice but to listen. Because we would realize and make the citizens realize the power they have to make citizens, to make the authorities listen. So this is the approach we are taking. And as Judo rightly said, we are also looking at, say, the Constitution, how to be proactive. So we've organized a sort of a seminar on Constitution building, given the importance, the centrality of the Constitution in the overall governance and development of this country. And very soon we are going to reconvene so that we develop our position paper on the kind of constitution we want for the Gambia. So that including this policy dialogue we're talking about, I see your point, but then these policy dialogues are important at every stage, so that even if the NDP, is already done, we have come out of a period where for 22 years, civil society has been pushed to the periphery, all right? And so we are regaining our position, we are regaining our voice, we are rebranding ourselves so that we play that role that we should have played more effectively in the past. Now, the space, one can claim the space is conducive, but we know this space doesn't necessarily or will not necessarily be conducive all the time. So we are determined to ensure this space remains open, that never again we are going to have a government that is going to close that space. And so we will invite ourselves to spaces, as Nuno said, to move on. So we will have this policy dialogue to look at the NDP. There are a lot of issues that need to be discussed still, even though it is done. It's financing. What is in fact the vision of the president? Specifically, and in practice, what approaches are they taking? So that we need to put all of those under scrutiny and discuss them. As a country, we cannot have a national development plan, and all we conceive of is a donors conference to fund that. Now, that's a contradiction. We have to take lead responsibility to put our money, in a thing that is for ourselves, first and foremost. We cannot engage in ad hoc development approaches. Hire electricity from Senegal, hire a boat from Turkey to provide electricity. We have to look at the long term. How do we ensure that we have a permanent, locally owned, nationally empowered mechanism, to provide energy in this country? Because also these are national security issues. What if Senegal cuts off their line today? What if that boat gets broken down today? What capacity is coming in that Senegal is going to make available to us? If they are just sending in electricity across the border, and so on and so forth. So we have the means in this country. If Q City is using wind power to run this place, why can Gambia government consider wind power? Why can Gambia consider solar energy, so that if you go to a country like China, for the whole state visit, what did you get? What should be your agenda? Look at our road network. What are you doing in terms of that? And how do you fund that? So all of these are issues that, with or without NDP, we need to put on the table and have a face-to-face, as you know is saying, with the states, that how do we take control of our development process so that we make sure our business and our economy grow?
But
Okay.
I just want to say, while that's important, I think we need to ensure that these dialogues are not elitist. How do we ensure that it reflects the man and woman down there actually has a voice in it, so that the voice is that not of civil society, is actually the voice of the people. So I think for me that is very important, that these dialogues are actually not held in halls. They are held at the meeting, because at the end of the day, it's the people who need to hold the state accountable. In some communities, in some countries, you have community scorecards. Community members actually looking at services that the state is providing and gauging whether that's meeting their needs or not. So we should avoid making this dialogue elitist. I think there should be people-centered and by the people.
Yeah, I think that's the realization why these Gambia V1 dialogues, we call them regional dialogues, are going into those communities. And, and going to communities to bring across the board all sectors of the population. And each dialogue is going to have resolutions that are going to be presented to the state. So, yeah, they definitely should not be elitist.
I like that point, because I think the sooner we broaden the consultative forum the better for government as well, because government wants to stay in power. And how do you stay in power? By getting the votes of the ordinary man. So the idea of the dialogue not being elitist, the idea of the dialogue being broad-based and having participation from the grassroots is very important. It is something that we need to pay attention to. But let me come to the last point that we'll perhaps discuss on today's forum. We have heard of complaints regarding the proliferation of NGOs in the Gambia. I think at some point in the previous regime, there was actually a need to begin to look at the idea of regulating. Why? Because certain people come on the pretext of creating NGOs to serve the communities and to serve the ordinary people, but in reality, they end up serving their own personal interests. Go out there, mobilize funds, come and say, okay, I'm an NGO, I'm going to do this. But in actuality, you're serving your own personal interest, be it the manager or be it the person, the proprietor or proprietress behind the NGO. Are those allegations valid? And if so, what is it that Tango is doing to help address that dispensation? Because it would definitely undermine the roles and the mandates of CSOs in this country.
Yeah, those allegations are valid. I mean, we remember in the past regime, we've had meetings at the level of the vice president then, and even parliamentarians would raise this issue that individuals would have, philanthropist support from Europe, for example, to bring in school items or so, get a duty waiver as civil society, only to discover that those items have been sold, by those persons. Yes, so they are valid, and Tango is concerned about that. And that is why one of the requirements of Tango membership, it looks at your governance management systems, structures, to ensure that there is transparency and accountability. I wouldn't say Tango has been extremely effective in enforcing those requirements, but as far as the membership of Tango is concerned, because people have to understand not all civil society organizations belong to Tango. It's a voluntary association, but Tango seeks to enforce, those requirements to a large extent. I'm not still satisfied with the level, and part of it also has to do with the environment in which we are. But this is something that in this new Gambia are the things we want to really also emphasize, that we cannot claim to hold the government to account when we are not accountable ourselves, when we are not transparent ourselves, when we are not effective and efficient ourselves. So we are very much concerned about that. In fact, towards the end of 2014, 2015, we had developed a peer review mechanism, which was submitted to the Tango General Assembly, but it wasn't fully approved yet, and we will present this to the next Tango General Assembly. The whole idea is, how do we ensure effective leadership, effective management, good governance, in our civil society organizations, in order for them to really deliver what they are set to deliver. So we are aware of these things, and it is going on, but certainly, again, where there is limited accountability, corruption takes place, inefficiency takes place, and so one cannot deny the fact that there have been other individuals who've taken advantage of, the whole environment to claim to be for civil society work, only to serve their own interest. That is a tough job to do. That's not just the role of Tango to fight, but government itself has to be part of that to ensure that, because government is one that registers legally civil society organizations in this country. So government itself has to raise its, capacity, to ensure they are registering legitimate organizations. We have an NGO affairs agency that has to be seen to be functional, even though one has to say that many regimes, and that is including the Gambia, do create those regulatory mechanisms mainly to control civil society, and not, in terms of limiting the ability to hold the state to account, and not necessarily to ensure transparency and accountability within the, civil society organizations. So we hope, as we try to change, that is Tango and the civil society, NGO affairs agency would also transform towards ensuring a better civil society and not as a control mechanism. And so one of the things we are also advocating in that regard is a review of the NGO Act, because as it is right now, the Act, you can, when you read it, you clearly see this is an Act meant to clamp down on civil society and not necessarily to help civil society to grow, to become transparent and accountable.
Gentlemen, we will have to leave it at that because we have come to the end of the program. We're very much appreciative to the both of you, Mr. Madi Jabate. Thank you for coming to this program and honoring us. And Mr. Drame, it's a pleasure. The discussions have been very fruitful, very insightful, and we hope that under the new Gambia dispensation and in our drive to promote this corporate Gambia identity, we would work together collectively in order to achieve that objective. Thank you very much.